Does God pick our kings? Now, I feel like if I were to ask you that, you would reply with an emphatic yes. God does do that. God picks our kings. God is the one who orchestrates that. Well, if that's the position you take, let's ask a few other questions. Should we vote? Should we campaign? Should we care? Now, others of you may reply with a few more questions and trying to figure that out, and I'm sure there's some in here who might even say no to that question, right? Does God pick our kings? No, he does not. But if you believe that God doesn't pick our kings, then what we're saying is we are left up to our own devices, that the campaigning and the persuading of our kings and leaders is ultimately what sets the tone, is ultimately how we get our various leaders. And that leads a lot more questions than answers. So, does God pick our kings? At the end of World War I, Germany was in significant disrepair. There were a lot of issues. The country was broken and had major penalties and settlements waged against it. Germany was forced to pay back billions of dollars a year to these countries that it had fought and subsequently lost to. And these reparation payments were crippling the economy. The economy suffered for decades because of this. They couldn't get anything going. They couldn't get anything started. And some would have even eventually go on to argue that these reparation payments were a little too much, that they had kind of ventured into the realm of unfair. So there were many in America and leaders in America calling for less reparation payments, and there were those in Europe calling for more. So whether they were fair or not is up for debate as to who you ask. But in the midst of this hardship, there was a new party or movement beginning to rise. They had one election, and this movement had 3% of the votes. In the next election, this movement had 16% of the votes in less than 2 years. And by the third election, this new movement and party had 36% of the votes. Their rising popularity led to their leader getting a prominent spot in the government, even though he was not elected. But then the struggling German economy finally collapsed in 1929 as the Great Depression started. America and other nations began to pull loans and began to call back loans because their economies were failing, and that essentially crushed the struggling German economy that was just starting to get its feet underneath it. Then, on an infamous day in 1933, a middle-aged man by the name of Adolf Hitler was granted power in Germany. He was given power because he promised something that many Germans were looking for. Adolf Hitler looked toward the outside and said, we're going to stop these reparation payments. We are tired of being trampled on. And the nation loved it. And he was granted power, and in his leadership, we know what eventually would happen. Many people suffered and died in his rise to power, and millions were murdered as a result of his leadership. Adolf Hitler promised exactly what the country was looking for. He promised to stop being trampled on by other nations, and then at the same time promised to really put the blame where it was due. And we know what happened. So we go back to the question, does God pick our kings? And I got to be careful. I don't want to step into this so cavalier and take a challenging, deeply personal topic and make it something just kind of out there. This is really tough. And it was actually really tough to kind of write this and to look at this and to dig into this. Because this is a very tough question. It's a very difficult idea, especially right now as we enter into our own election. We are beginning to step into this and wondering what's going on. But this extreme example of Germany and Hitler's rise to power helps us understand a little bit about what's going on in Judges 9. So as we begin to look at chapter 9, you need to know a little bit of the history surrounding this. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. We see Judges 9 comes at the end of Gideon's life. Gideon was a judge. Try to get my head wrapped around it. Gideon was a judge for Israel. We know the famous story of the fleece. He lays out the fleece, and there's dew on the fleece, and there's dew not on the fleece, so that he knows God wants him to lead, and God wants him to be their judge. We also know the story of Gideon dwindling his army down from thousands of soldiers to 300 soldiers to fight the enemy. And ultimately, Gideon wins, or well, God wins. Gideon, after this battle and after freeing Israel from their oppressors, leads and judges Israel for 40 years. And we kind of get into the middle of this. But then in verses 8, or chapter 8, 22 through 23, we see the nation has an interesting question for Gideon. They ask him to become king. So verse 22 of chapter 8. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your sons and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." They settle themselves after Gideon's victory, and now they ask him to be their king. He declines this offer and reaffirms God as their king. If you continue to read the story, you'll see that his deeply spiritual response is not quite so spiritual. In the next verse, he says, "Bring me all your gold so I can make a dress basically for myself and be your ruler that way." Even though he declines to be the king, he acts as a king. But nonetheless, he declines it, and he leads for 40 years. And despite his many shortcomings and issues, the nation loved him, and he eventually dies. At this point, his one son Abimelech decides, "Hey, I really like this king idea." And he convinces his brothers and his people to make him king. And so despite Gideon's refusal to be king, we know that Abimelech means son of the king. And so even though Gideon said, "I'm not your king," he in many ways acts like a king, and we take this to mean that he really thought he was their king. And so Abimelech decides that he wants to be king. Abimelech was the son of a concubine, and his mother was a Shechemite. And he convinces the other Shechemites that they should let him be king, because him being king is a lot better than the Israelites being king over them. And they like this plan. And then we see in chapter 9, 1 through 6, Abimelech is made king, and he kills 70 of Gideon's sons. The murder of Gideon's children is carried out, and all 70 of Gideon's sons are killed on the same stone, all except for one, Jotham, who runs and hides. And now we have reached Jotham's parable that we've already read this morning. Jotham, who has survived the bloodbath, comes out and stands on top of Mount Gerizim and decides to give his parable, in what is often regarded as the first parable in the Bible. Jotham's name means the Lord is perfect and honest. In the midst of all of this hatred and bloodshed and death, Jotham speaks out and condemns what they have done. But like I said, we get the first parable in the Bible, and it centers around our idea of kings and leaders. So let's read a little bit again here. Chapter 9, verse 7. "And when it was told to Jotham, he went and stood up on Mount Gerizim and cried aloud and said to them, 'Listen to me, you leaders of Shechem, that God may listen to you. The trees once went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance by which gods and men are honored, and go hold sway over the trees? And the tree said to the fig tree, you come reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go hold sway over the trees? And the tree said to the vine, you come reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and hold sway over the trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you're anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out from the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Jotham has just concluded the first parable in Scripture. Parables were a common way of teaching lessons and condemning people. Jotham is doing this in a way they would have expected, in a way they would have known. We see in the New Testament, Jesus does the same thing. He teaches many lessons and many ideas through parables. Both men here are using what is expected and what would have been understood. And so they would have known, as Jotham said this parable, that he is condemning them, that he is calling them out for what they have done. His parable centers around also a common metaphor, the idea of trees. Trees symbolize different things in this day and time, but one of the things they symbolized was kings. It was the same idea of saying that you'd hide under the shade of a king. You would stand under the shade of a king. It was this idea of protection. It was this idea of protecting the people underneath him. And so he uses this idea, this common idea of trees, to teach this valuable lesson. And he begins to speak to the people at the top of Mount Gerizim, and he tells this parable. So we see in verse 7, Jotham stands where everyone can hear. He stands on top of Mount Gerizim. Thanks to the natural state of this mountain, as well as Israel's dry climate, you can hear for a long way off. He stands up where everybody can hear him. And he goes to the top of this Mount Gerizim and he begins to cry out. Also, Mount Gerizim, if you remember, is where Moses sends the people to call out blessings over Israel. Jotham picks a very fitting place to give this parable, both in its natural acoustics as well as its long history in Israel. And he calls out. Verses 8 and 9, he asks the olive tree to rule over them. Olive trees are extremely important, even still. Their oil is used for all sorts of things, as well as the olives for food. We see that in the tabernacle and the lampstands, they use this oil to burn. It was also used to anoint priests and kings. Olives are extremely important for all sorts of things in this day and time. And so he starts with the olive tree, one of the most important trees that they have. But the olive tree declines. It seems that the olive tree would rather anoint someone else with its oil than itself. So they move on. And they ask the fig tree. After the olive tree turns them down, they go to the fig tree. Fig trees are also very important for the agricultural economy. The fig tree was and still is one of the staple fruits in the region. So they go from the olive tree, which is extremely important, to the fig tree, which is equally important. Both of these decline the opportunity to be king. And then they move on from the trees and they go and ask the vine. And they say, "Vine, rule over us." The trees, after being unsuccessful to convince the trees, decide to see if the vine will do. The vine, in the same ways as the trees, declines their offer. The vine also has a spiritual purposes and practical purposes. Wine was a staple in every home, also used in the temple. The vine, looking at all the way it is used, also turns down this offer. We'll see later that rabbis would later link these trees to former judges over Israel. They see them as Othniel, Deborah, and Gideon, but this view is highly debated. A more general view holds that we're just talking about men and leaders who have a lot of good things to offer, who have a lot of influence, and they don't want to step away from their usefulness. They don't want to step away from what they can do. And so the trees are looking for people who are good and serve a purpose. They look to natural leaders, to people who are naturally doing what they should do, who have something to offer. When good leaders turn them down, they begin to turn their attention somewhere else. And we see here verses 14 and 15, after the olive tree and the fig tree and the vine say no, they go and ask the bramble bush. This was a prickly boxwood. As you would expect, these bushes were a source of frustration in Israel. They overtook crops and land. They had to constantly be pushed back and trimmed back from overtaking people's property. And then the small dry bush had another issue. It would often spontaneously combust in the hot, dry climate. And it would generate enough heat that it would actually burn trees. These bramble bushes could be used for kindling, but that was really about their only usefulness. They had no other usefulness beyond this. But the bramble bush decides to accept their generous offer and accepts the position of king over the trees and invites them to sit in his shade. If this situation surrounding this parable was not so tragic, this would be a very funny idea. This bush that sits low to the ground has offered shade to the cedars of Lebanon. And this picture of a tree stooping down to hide under the shade of a bramble bush is a very absurd idea. It's absurd with any tree that you see. It would especially have been absurd with this idea of the cedars of Lebanon that can grow anywhere between 60 and 120 feet high and spread out. This tree stooping to this level is unthinkable. Like I said, if it wasn't so sad and tragic what Jotham has just gone through, it would have certainly garnered laughs. But the parable is ended, and Jotham has painted quite a picture of the leadership choices. Like I said, there's some debate as to who these trees are exactly referring to, but we know that the bramble bush is talking about Abimelech. But he continues to condemn this nation in their actions, and he has this pronouncement to give over them. So verses 16 through 21, we see Jotham's pronouncement. Now, therefore, if you acted in good faith and integrity when you made Abimelech king, and if you have dealt with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as deeds deserved, for my father fought for you and risked his life and delivered you from the hand of Midian, and you have risen up against my father's house this day and have killed his sons, 70 men on one stone, and have made Abimelech the son of his female servant king over the leaders of Shechem, because he is your relative. If you have then acted in good faith and integrity with Jerubbaal and with the house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem and Beth Milo, and let fire come from the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Milo and devour Abimelech. And Jotham ran away and fled and went to Beer and lived there because of his Abimelech, his brother. Jotham now questions their actions. He questions their motives. His first-person rhetorical style steps away from the parable and gives his condemnation, a personal condemnation for their actions. And he does this in the form of rhetorical questions and if-then statements. If you've treated us well, then rejoice. If you haven't, may you all be punished. We know, as well as Jotham knows, despite his questioning style, that the men have not treated his family well. They have taken Gideon's sons, who fought for them, risked his life to save them, and they have killed them. And we know this story, and we know what they've done. Those listening would have seen the obvious connection to the bramble bush as he talks about fire. The bramble bush will only destroy and burn things. Jotham's comment about fire was seen as picking up on the bramble bush. So 9:49 through 57, let's finish the story here of what has happened here. What eventually happens is everything burns. As Jotham has foretold, everything burns. Abimelech is killed when a millstone is dropped on his head. He burns down Shechem, and the Shechemites burn down his stuff, and exactly what Jotham has foretold. Many people die because of this. Many people die in Abimelech's war against his own people. Most stories in the book of Judges end this way, or end in a similar way. There's a lot of hurt and brokenness and very little upside. And the reader can be left wondering, why is all this here? What do we do with this? So, let's circle back around to the question. How does this connect with Kings or our election? Why does this matter, and how does this help? And so, in an effort to understand and answer that question, what we're going to do is we're going to end with some applications here. So the first application is this. Jotham's parable views kings as a decidedly negative thing. This idea is also seen in Samuel. As Samuel's conversation with Israel in 1 Samuel 8, when God tells Israel they don't want a king because a king is only going to take and only going to hurt you. Jotham is saying the same thing. He's showing them that they don't want a king, and they especially don't want this king. Jotham goes about it differently, but the message inherently is the same. But how does that affect us? Once again, we live in a world ruled by leaders and voted on, and those who even just take it. We are not going to be able to turn the whole leadership of our nation around and change the whole leadership structure, and we've got to understand that we are not called biblically to do that. But we have to realize the Bible consistently points out the shortcomings of these organizations and of leaders and of kings. We can't put our hope and faith in them. whether that's a king, president, or even an institution. Earthly leaders will let us down, whether our candidate wins or loses. We cannot put our hope and faith in them. Now, does this mean that every leader has ill will or is evil? No. There are certainly some good leaders. But putting our faith and hope in this institution will ultimately let us down. What's the next application? Many leaders will promise things they can't fulfill to be given leadership positions. Now, I know this is news to you. You've never experienced this ever in your entire lives. No one here has ever been let down by the false promises of a leader, somebody trying to be elected. And we know that Jotham's parable paints this picture in a very strong contrast. We see the bramble bushes offering shade to the cedars of Lebanon. The king is promising things he isn't even capable of giving. He can't even do. As Christians, we need to be wise enough to see through the lies and the empty promises. The Bible tells us that these leaders are going to let us down. This parable should be a reminder and a warning to that. As we listen and as we hear, we should be reminded of that. There's an interesting statistic that I came across a few years back that says 60% of pastor search committee members will leave a church within 1 year of hiring a new pastor. There's always a lot of different reasons why people may leave a church, moving, taking a job, or whatever thing might happen, but 60% is a staggering number. And I was informed of this as I talked to a former member of what is now a mega church, and this man was on the search committee for this church. And he told me that it turns out most search committees will leave after they hire a new pastor. And I asked him, I said, well, what happened here? Why did you leave? And his simple answer was, he lied. The member felt that the pastor lied during his interviews and wasn't going to do what he claimed he was going to do. He had no intentions of fulfilling what he promised he would do for that church. Many leaders will promise things they can't fulfill to be given leadership positions. And as Christians, we need to be wise enough to realize that. And we need to put ourselves in positions to help understand when that is going to happen. What's the next application? Many leaders pursue leadership positions to fulfill their own narcissistic desires. Jotham looks at all the great types of people who could lead the nation and then shows them how these leaders turned them down. They didn't want to give up their influence or stop how they were helping the community. However, the bramble bush is excited. The bramble bush is ready. He wants to lead. How many times do leaders show up more interested in their own egos and desires than those of the people they are leading? They use nations, institutions, or even churches to get what they want rather than to lead well. We may not be able to avoid these types of leaders on a national level, but we should be mentally and emotionally prepared for when it happens. On a smaller level of community and church leadership, we should have systems and questions in place to help us avoid these types of leaders. There is nothing that will kill a local church faster than a narcissistic leader. Narcissistic pastors never listen to their congregation and will always assume the problems are everybody else's fault. Narcissistic leaders destroy what they have been given and leave when there's nothing left. Essentially, they burn down the organization and then leave. We've seen this in churches all over the United States. Narcissistic pastors are being forced to resign after leaving a wake of trauma in their churches. And it's always sad, and it's always broken. But let us turn back to the question, does God pick our kings? Part of this answer to this question brings us to the last application of this parable. We get the kings we deserve and want. This is a difficult reality of leadership and picking leaders. We get the kings we deserve. We could also say we get the kings we're willing to stoop down for. A while back, I had a conversation with somebody who was the head of a search committee for a church. The search began to drag on, and there began to be issues, and there began to be frustrations, and after a year and a half of looking, the church began to grow impatient. Well, they finally narrowed it down to a few good candidates, and for various reasons, these candidates declined the opportunity. Nothing inherently wrong, but there's always just different things that go on with this. And after this, the church became frustrated. And they began to question the process and question the committee's ability. And then they interviewed a guy who could start right now, who could start that Sunday. He was no longer at the church. He was no longer a pastor. And the head of the search committee told me that the church that he came from would never tell them why he was no longer their pastor. And this man has always lamented in every conversation we've ever had about it that he should have stood up and said something. That he should have fought back and told the church to be patient and told the committee to wait. But they ended up hiring this man, and what they hired was a narcissistic pastor who has shut down almost every ministry at that church. He has yelled at congregants. He has run off staff. And the church is barely a shell of what it was before. They asked me about this, and I knew this parable. And sometimes I can be a little more turt than I mean to be, and I pointed out that God gives us the leaders we deserve. Their quick reply was, no, we didn't deserve or want this. And I asked a few questions about life before this pastor. What happened before this pastor? I said, were you guys doing outreach before he came? No. They complained about his sermons. I said, were you guys preaching exegetically, biblically sound sermons before he was your pastor? No. Were you guys doing mission trips before he got here? No. Was your church willing to wait for the olive tree? No. We get the pastors and the leaders we want and deserve. Daniel Block puts it this way. In the words of a modern sage, people tend to get the leaders they deserve. Jotham's fable is not only a polemic against the certain kind of kingship, it is actually directed primarily at those who are foolish enough to anoint a worthless man to be king. I know of another church that has lamented the pastor's sermons and theology. They wondered how we ended up with this. How did we get this? Their previous pastor was a very godly man. He was a man who preached biblically sound and biblically based sermons, and they questioned, how did we get to this point? The questions then are simple. Well, did you question this pastor's theology before he got there? No, we didn't. Did you listen to his sermons before you hired him? Well, he only had a few online. Did you ask him about his influences and question him? No. Did you check his resume to make sure it was correct? No. Then you got the leader you wanted. And the irony is not lost on me, as I am fairly new here and has gone through my own pastor search with y'all. And that's why I said at the beginning there is a certain amount of fear and trepidation as I step into this sermon. So, I will say this isn't always negative. At a time when the nation was splitting and falling apart and beginning to rip itself apart, Abraham Lincoln was elected to the presidency. Lincoln was the right leader at the right time. And there are also plenty of healthy churches with healthy pastors. And I think of this church. This church, if you weren't there that morning, grilled me on my theology for about an hour, over an hour. Asked me about my preaching style and what I was going to do and why I was called here, why I was leaving, and every question you can imagine. And after this, I looked at my wife as I got to walk in the 100-degree heat back up here. And I said, this church cares about the Bible. This church wants a pastor who's going to continue the tradition already started of exegetical expository preaching. And so my hope and my prayer is that you guys have also got the pastor that you deserve, is my hope and prayer. They want a pastor who's going to preach the Bible and lead. I've sat in many interviews and I've had many theological conversations, but nobody has ever questioned me so extensively about the Bible as here. We could go on for a while of good and bad leaders, and I'm sure many of you, as you think, could think of the same. You have story after story. But I will also encourage you to look at this rule backwards. You can tell the type of country you live in, and the organization you work for, or the church you attend by its leader. If a place has a bad leader, they will always try to convince you that the leader is the outlier. Don't believe them. They got the leader they deserved. When Israel asked for a king, they wanted a king who looked like a king. They wanted a king who could stand up to other nations. They wanted a king who could lead their army. If you remember, they never asked anything about his spiritual well-being, his moral aptitude, his ability to lead, his ability to judge. They wanted a king who looked like a king, and God gave them Saul. Why would God give them a king who was going to reject God? Because Israel was a nation that had just rejected God. We get the leaders we deserve. Germany in 1933 was on the brink of collapse. Its infrastructure was falling apart. The reparation payments had crippled their economy. The country was crying out for a strong leader who could stand up to the oppression, and it desperately wanted somebody to blame for their problems. In the midst of this, Hitler rose to power, and the Nazi Party brought a reign of terror and brokenness that lasted a little over a decade and ended with the murder of millions. They got the strong leader who brought fear and death to the rest of the world that they were looking for. But as usual with revenge, it started with empowerment and ended in brokenness. So does God pick our kings? The answer is both. Yes, God is sovereign and will continue to be sovereign over all things and will give us the leaders we deserve and want. Abimelech was the king the Shechemites deserved, and the murderers were eventually murdered. So, at the end of a highly encouraging sermon, what should we do? We get to the end of this parable and this passage, and we can feel like there's nothing we can do about it. And I think of what my kids have started saying a lot, even though they did not get it from me or my wife. You get what you get and don't throw a fit. It can be easy to walk into our election and other leadership things and think this and act this way. But is this what we're called to do? No. There's always things that can and should be done. First, we pray. We pray for our election and we pray for our leaders. If we want God to give us the leaders we need and not the leaders we deserve as a nation, then we need to pray for that. Pray God will begin to raise up godly leaders who can bring His will. We should continually pray for our leaders, whether we like them or not. And we should continually pray God will raise up the men and women to lead who will bring the focus back to Him. Second, we need to get involved. Getting the leaders we deserve often comes from not being involved. If we want to be strong spiritual influences in our county schools and we want a strong spiritual influence in our local politics or in our national politics, then we have to do something about it. This could be helping campaigns or even thinking about running ourselves. Part of what makes the Christian perspective different than the world around us is the importance of pushing away the bramble bush, is understanding how important it is to fight against the bramble bush and pursue the olive tree. We need to vote and encourage good leaders to take leadership positions. Third, we need to remember that God is in control. This is not an excuse for us to do nothing, but it should encourage us as we walk into an uncertain future and deal with an uncertain election. The Bible tells us that King Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed Jerusalem and killed thousands, was God's servant. We also know that King Cyrus, who ruled over Persia, was God's instrument. We worship a sovereign God. We won't always be free from bad leaders because we live in a very fallen world. But God uses broken people all the time. As the band comes up, the fourth is pay attention. Elections and new hirings let us know the direction things are going. What sets Christians apart is knowing this and acting accordingly. We can tell the spiritual aptitude of our nation or churches by their leaders. We know our nation is moving away from God, and our leaders let us know at what rate that is happening. Now, we should know how to act. We should act accordingly if a nation, we should know how to act and act accordingly. Now, how should we act if a nation elects an ungodly leader? We'll get to that in a few weeks. And we'll talk about that. But for now, we need to pay attention. We can know the direction of our nation and our institutions by the leaders they pick. So as we will end every week through this series, we will end with a prayer and a prayer request. This morning, we need to pray that God will begin to raise up and encourage the leaders we need. We don't want the bramble bush. And that means others need to be willing to stand up and step into leadership. If we want to be a church, a nation that gets the leaders we need, then we need to be the church and nation that prays for those leaders. God will continue to give us the leaders we want. And we show which leaders we want. Our job, God will continue to give us the leaders we want. So we need to pray that God gives us the leaders we need.